Today, we're going to be talking about the story of Moses. This week and next week, we're going to be talking about two different stories from the life of Moses that reflect on the theme that we're talking about this fall of God's promises, God's deliverance out of the midst of the shadows and the darkness. This week, we're going to be looking at Exodus 14. Exodus 14 is the story of the deliverance of God's people through the Red Sea. And it's kind of a sticky wicket. It's a little bit of an uncomfortable story. We don't always like the way that God comes across in this story. And so we're going to break it down into a couple different parts. Now, I said the author of Exodus, and we've talked about this before when we talked about Noah in the beginning, very, very beginning of the story. So if you haven't seen that video, you can go back and I'll link it to hear more about this idea. But there is a theory, a common theory among biblical scholars now about what's called the source theory. This is the idea that there were essentially four writers, four people, groups probably, not just people, who were involved in the writing of Exodus. There is the Yahwist source, which they call J, who was really interested in God and lifting God up and showing God in the best possible light. There is the Elohist source. The Elohist source is named because it always refers to God as Elohim, which is the name that God revealed to Moses. He is obsessed with the traditions of the kingdom of Israel and talks a lot about Joshua and Joseph. And then we have the priestly source. His style is completely different from the other writers of the Pentateuch. He is concerned with the priestly work, priestly matters, things like ritual law, shrines, and genealogies, all in a formal, repetitive style. And then we have what's called the redactor, and this is the person who put everything together, who compiled all these sources into one coherent, cohesive narrative. And the redactor has an intention and a purpose. The redactor's purpose is to show how the Exodus story, how Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible, remind and show the people who are in Babylon, who are in exile, that God will deliver them, that God delivers on God's promises. And so as we hear the stories of Genesis and Exodus, we need to remember that it's done in the context of a people group who are in exile themselves. And so what does that tell us about the story? One of the really important things that we hear about this story is that Exodus is the defining event of Israel's history. Even in modern day Judaism, Exodus is the story we can point to that say something about our identity. One of my defining stories is my appearance on Jeopardy! It was a validation, a culmination of a life of scholarship, of study, of trivia, of science bowls and math contests and geekdom, right? And so I went on Jeopardy! And now it's almost a shorthand for all of those things, right? It's one of my defining stories. I have others. Similarly, people groups, religious groups have defining stories, things that tell us something about who they are. Exodus is the defining story because this is the first time, the first mentioned moment of a people known as Israel. Now, before this, we always hear them talk about as Hebrews, which is just a type of people, which means lower class people, mostly slaves and servants. And this is the first time this group of people is known as the Israelites. And it's because of this passage through the waters that they become the people Israel. Now that tells us something about who they are and who we are. Isaiah uses it repeatedly over and over again, and beginning in chapter 40 especially, to talk about the idea that God delivered the Israelites once before. And God will deliver them again now from the Babylonian exile, just as God did before. It's an origin story which reminds the people who they are and who their God is. Remember, God delivered you through the waters of the Red Sea. God will deliver you again from this exile and this captivity. And so we need to think about, carefully consider what our origin stories are. What are the 2 or 3 that we tell ourselves about ourselves? What are the stories, the histories that we continually repeat over and over again? Here in America, you hear the stories of the War of Independence of 1776 through, the years that followed. And those stories tell us something about who we are as a nation, who we are as a country. And my guess is that wherever you are, wherever you're listening to this, your country has an origin story, has a national story that it tells itself about who they are over time, over history, how they came to be where they were. You hear the British people talking about keep calm and carry on, that they made it through World War II by having a stiff upper lip and holding their chins up and just getting on with life. And even today, you hear in them, in the midst of crisis, talk about just holding up their chins and making through. And in moments of crisis, it's these stories, these origin stories, that we rely on to get us through. But I bet your family, I bet you have stories like that, about times where you came through adversity and you became the person who you are. And so I invite you to consider, what are the stories you tell yourself about yourself? And are they stories designed to lift you up, to give you strength and courage along the way? Or are they stories which keep you locked in? Are they stories which keep you from hearing God's message, God's voice speak to you? Are they stories which paint you in a negative light instead of in the glorious wonder that you are? What is your origin story?